Let me tell you something about Verath Canyon before I tell you anything else. Most people on Iron 5 didn't talk about it, not because they were afraid of the place exactly, though they were, but because talking about it felt like inviting it into your life, like saying the name of something you'd rather pretend didn't exist. The canyon was 700 meters deep in some sections. In others it went past 1,000. The walls were made of this dark reddish-black rock that didn't reflect light the way rock normally does. It seemed to absorb it, pull it in, like the whole cliff face was slightly hungry. Local weather systems created permanent thermal columns inside the canyon that made any kind of controlled descent nearly impossible. Iron 5 was a border world, which meant it sat at the edge of what the Galactic Compact called civilized space. And like most border worlds, it had more rules than it could enforce and more lawlessness than anyone admitted out loud. The canyon was where things ended. That was just understood. I'd been living at the bottom of it for about 4 months. Not by accident. I want to be clear about that because I know how it sounds. I want to say I had a plan, and I did, but the honest truth is the plan was mostly just go somewhere nobody will look for you and wait. I'd had a falling out with my freight company, Voss Consolidated. You probably haven't heard of them. They've changed their name 3 times since the treaty, and the falling out involved some cargo manifests that were missing certain line items and certain compact officials who were asking questions I didn't want to answer in a room with a recorder running. So I went underground. Literally, as it turned out. The bottom of Verath Canyon had a kind of settlement, if you could call it that. More of a collection of people who had nowhere else to be. There were maybe 40 of us down there at any given time, rotating in and out, sleeping in the excavated rock shelters left over from a failed mining operation from about 60 years back. The Torvath Mining Consortium had tried to pull metallite ore from the canyon walls, and they'd gotten 3 years into the operation before a pressure event collapsed 2 of their primary shafts and killed 11 of their workers. After that, nobody came back to resume the work. The equipment was still there, massive boring rigs, cranes, or separators, all of it frozen in place and slowly rusting or oxidizing, or doing whatever metal does in the specific atmospheric chemistry of Iron 5 canyon floor. We used the equipment for shelter. We draped salvaged thermal sheets over the crane arms to block wind. We built cooking stations inside the ore separators because their metal shells kept heat in. It was rough, and it smelled like old machinery and damp rock, and whatever 40 people cooking communal meals produces when the ventilation isn't great. But it was survivable. It was, in its way, a community. The canyon floor had a river running through it, not a big one, more of a narrow, fierce thing that moved fast and cold and clear. The locals, the Iron 5 natives who weren't technically part of our group but tolerated us, called it the Vrethka. It was fed by underground springs further in the canyon's interior. Good water. That was one of the things that made the bottom of the canyon livable. You had water, you had shelter from the salvaged mining infrastructure, and you had something the surface didn't have. The canyon walls blocked the sensor sweeps that the compact patrol vessels ran over the border territories. Down in Verath, you were invisible. That was the point for most of us. My shelter was cut into the eastern cliff face, about 30 meters from the canyon floor. The old mining crews had used it as a supervisor's post. There was a window-like opening in the rock wall, and the interior was about 3 meters deep and 4 meters wide, with enough ceiling clearance that I could stand fully upright without hunching. I'd gotten it by showing up early and claiming it before the newer arrivals could, which was really just luck. I'd brought a rolled sleeping mat, a second-hand thermal blanket, a cook kit, and a water purification unit that worked about 80% of the time. I'd also brought my tools, because even in hiding I was still technically a mechanic. Freight mechanics don't really stop being freight mechanics. You just point the skills somewhere different. I'd rigged a sensor net around my shelter, nothing sophisticated, just pressure triggers and a few passive optical sensors that I'd built from components I'd brought with me, and a few more I'd traded for down at the canyon floor. The triggers would wake me if anything heavy moved toward my position in the dark. It wasn't much. It wasn't meant to be. It was just enough to give me a few seconds of warning if I needed to make a decision. I had a weapon. I'll mention that now. A pulse carbine, civilian grade, modified for distance. It wasn't military hardware, but it had been worked on by someone who knew what they were doing. I'd bought it from a retired compact soldier in a transit station on the way out of the freight lane, and he'd been clear about what it could and couldn't do. Could incapacitate most humanoid form species at up to 300 meters with a center mass hit. Couldn't penetrate military-grade personal shielding, go through hardened vehicle armor, or do anything useful against an orbital platform. Fine. I wasn't planning to fight an orbital platform. I'd settled into a routine. Most days I spent working. I'd gotten word to a few people that there was a mechanic at the bottom of Verath if you could get equipment down to me, and a slow trickle of work had come in. Broken atmospheric processors, ground vehicle components, sensor arrays that had taken damage in the rough border world weather. I fixed things. I got paid in supplies and in the kind of currency that doesn't show up in compact financial records. I kept my head down. I slept when it was dark, worked when it was light, and tried not to think too much about the life I'd left behind on Earth. Real Earth, not one of the colonial station Earths the compact liked to put on their maps as if they counted. Earth was a long way away, most things were. I'd been on Iron 5 for about 7 months total by the time it happened. 4 of those months at the canyon bottom. I knew the place by then, knew its moods, its rhythms, the way the wind sounded when it came down from the rim in the evening, the way the river changed pitch when it rained on the plateau above. I knew which rock faces shed loose material in the early morning and which ones were stable. I knew the 3 other long-term residents by name. Kessa, who was an Vrethian botanist and had been down here even longer than me. Paul, a former compact medic who never explained why he'd left his post and you learned quickly not to ask. And old Reth, who didn't talk much but who'd been at the bottom of this canyon for what he claimed was 11 years, and who I fully believed. We didn't bother each other. That was the main social contract. You don't bother me, I don't bother you, and if something goes wrong, we help each other because down here we're all we've got. It was on a Cycle 7 evening, midway through the 3rd month of that year, that I heard the sound. I was at my workbench. I'd set up a proper one outside the shelter entrance, on a natural rock ledge that jutted from the cliff face and gave me a good working surface. Good light during the day hours, protected from above by an overhang that caught most of the weather. I was working on a compression fitting for someone's cargo hauler. Finicky work, required patience, the kind of thing I actually enjoyed because it was meditative in a way that didn't require me to think about anything else. The canyon was in its evening state, which meant the thermal columns had calmed down, and the wind was doing that low moaning thing through the rock formations up near the rim. The river below was a constant low murmur. The sky above, what you could see of it between the canyon walls, had gone the dark gold color it turned before the moons rose. Then I heard it. It was a sound I'd never heard before. Not from this canyon, not from anywhere. It was like something very large and very fast cutting through air, but with a harmonic underneath it that was almost like a voice, not words, not language, more like a sustained note from something biological. And it was coming from above and getting louder very quickly. I put down my tools. I stood up and looked up at the narrow strip of darkening sky visible between the canyon walls. For a second I didn't see anything. Just the usual, the rock walls, the distant rim, the first faint stars coming through. Then I saw it, a shape, falling. It was falling fast, not tumbling, not spinning uncontrolled the way a dropped object falls. It was falling with a kind of orientation, as if whatever it was aware of its own descent. But it was definitely falling, dropping from the canyon rim. The sound was coming from it. I tracked it as it came down. My eyes were good in low light. I'd spent enough time in poorly lit spaces that my night vision had gotten reasonably sharp, and as the shape got closer I started to make out details. It was a figure, humanoid but not human. Roughly human-sized, maybe slightly smaller, lean, with limbs that were proportioned just slightly wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. The falling figure was wrapped in something that looked like fabric, but the fabric was moving, billowing, and there was a glow coming from it. Faint, blue-white, pulsing in time with the sound I'd been hearing. It was a living thing, falling from the top of Verath Canyon. I had maybe 2-3 seconds to process this before instinct took over. I was already moving before I'd fully made the decision. There's a thing that happens sometimes. I've only experienced it a handful of times in my life, where your body just acts and your mind catches up later. Like the part of you that's connected to your survival wiring skips the deliberation phase entirely and just goes. I was down the rope ladder from my ledge and onto the canyon floor in seconds. The river was in front of me, maybe 15 meters, and beyond it was a wide, flat area of compressed gravel and rock that the old mining crew had cleared and leveled during operations. It was the largest open area at the canyon bottom. The falling figure was heading for the cliff face on the far side of the canyon. At the current trajectory, it was going to hit rock. I did something that was probably one of the 3 or 4 stupidest things I have ever done in a life that has contained quite a few stupid things. I ran across the canyon floor to the flat gravel area, and I did what I knew how to do from 4 years of cargo handling. I looked at the trajectory. I calculated in my head, rough, imprecise, instinctive, where the impact point was going to be, and I positioned myself. I was not going to catch this figure. I'm not insane. Whatever was falling weighed more than I could absorb from that height. But I had 2 large salvaged thermal blankets in a storage container 10 meters away. We kept them there for emergencies, and the mining operation had left behind a system of cable and pulley rigs along the canyon walls. I'd spent 4 months learning every piece of that equipment. I knew which cables were load-bearing and which were decorative rust. I knew which pulleys still moved freely. I ran to the storage container, grabbed both thermal blankets, moved to a position I calculated to be directly under the adjusted trajectory, and I did something very impractical that somehow worked. I've thought about the physics of this moment many times since it happened. I can't fully explain why it worked. The thermal blankets were designed to hold heat, not to arrest motion. But when you spread 2 of them wide, and I spread them as wide as I possibly could, holding one edge in each hand and bracing my feet against a rock formation, and when the falling figure hit them at exactly the right angle, there was a moment of distributed force that was not the same as a direct impact. The blanket stretched. I was knocked off my feet and hit the ground hard enough to leave marks on the rock. One of the blankets tore clean through. The figure hit the gravel beside me in a controlled half-tumble, not a clean landing, not safe exactly, but not a direct fall from height onto unyielding rock. The sound stopped. The glow from the figure's wrappings faded to almost nothing. I lay on my back on the canyon gravel for a moment, staring up at the narrow strip of sky between the walls, and I thought, that was possibly the single dumbest thing I've ever done. Then I rolled over and looked at who I just more or less caught. She was lying face down on the gravel, and the first thing I noticed was the bioluminescence. That's the only word I had for it then, and it's the only word I have for it now. Her skin, visible on her hands, her neck, the parts of her face I could see, was shifting slowly through a light pattern. Cool blues and soft greens, moving across her skin the way auroras move across a sky, not bright enough to illuminate the canyon, just present. A slow, biological light that told me her body was doing something. She was breathing. I could see the movement in her back, shallow and fast but breathing. Her wrappings, I kept calling them that because I didn't have a better word, were some kind of garment, layered, very fine material that had taken serious damage from the fall, torn in several places. There was a deep laceration on her left arm, visible through a tear in the fabric, and it was bleeding, but the blood wasn't red. It was dark, with a slight luminescent quality, the same blue-green as her bioluminescence. I knew enough about interspecies biology. Freight mechanics get exposure to a lot of species when you're hauling cargo on the galactic lanes, to know that what mattered right now was the same for every breathing species I'd encountered. Keep the airway clear, stop bleeding if you can, don't move the patient if you don't know what injuries they might have sustained. I moved to her side, careful. "Hey," I said, which in retrospect was a deeply inadequate greeting. Her head moved, slightly, and then she made a sound that I felt as much as heard, a low resonant tone that my translator implant struggled with for a moment before it started to parse. The implant was old, a second-generation model, and it was better with common trade languages than with anything rare. It sputtered for a second and then gave me fragmented output. Pain, confuse, where, alive. "Yeah," I said. "You're alive. You hit the ground but not the cliff. I slowed you down some. You're going to feel it for a while." Her head turned, and I got my first look at her face. I've described this to a lot of people since. I always struggle with it because my instinct is to use familiar human references, and none of them are quite right. She was humanoid in the basic sense: 2 eyes, positioned at the front, a nose structure, a mouth, bilateral symmetry. But the proportions were different. Her eyes were larger relative to her face, and the iris color was that same shifting blue-green that moved across her skin. Her skull had a slight crest along the top, not dramatic, just a ridge, and her ears were set lower on her head than human ears. Her skin, under the bioluminescence, was a very dark gray, almost charcoal. She was young. I don't know how I knew that. The biology was foreign enough that I shouldn't have been able to read it, but something in her face communicated youth. And right now, it communicated pain and confusion and a kind of terrified disbelief. "Who?" my implant translated haltingly. "Who, you?" "Marcus," I said. "My name's Marcus. I'm a human from Earth. I live down here." I paused. "Someone threw you off the canyon rim." Her eyes, those luminous, changing eyes, focused on me with an expression I could read despite every biological difference. Pure shock, not at the fact of being thrown, at something else, at me. "Human," she said, and my implant didn't need to struggle with that one. The word came through clean and clear. Whatever language she was speaking, she knew that word in something close enough to galactic standard that the implant could grab it. "That's right," I said. "Human," she said again, and now there was something in her voice that I couldn't classify. Not relief, not exactly. Something older than relief. Something that sounded almost like recognition. I didn't know what to do with that, so I did what I knew how to do. I got up, went to my supply kit, and came back with a field dressing and my water purification unit. I cleaned the laceration on her arm. The dressing was human spec, which meant it might not interface correctly with her biology, but stopping blood loss was stopping blood loss. She let me do it without pulling away, watching my hands the entire time with those shifting light eyes. "Can you move?" I asked. A pause. She tried, her face tightened with pain. "Yes," my implant gave me uncertainly, "some." "Okay, we're going to move you off the gravel into my shelter. Slowly. The canyon gets cold at night and you need to be off the ground." She looked up at the canyon walls around her, at the narrow sky above, at the ancient mining equipment looming in the semi-darkness, at the river, catching what light remained and carrying it somewhere deeper into the canyon. And then she looked at me, and in her expression I read something that I recognized because I'd felt it myself, the first time I came down here. That specific quality of realizing you have survived something that should have killed you, and not knowing yet whether survival was the right outcome. "Okay," she said. And that was the beginning of it, the beginning of everything, really. Part 2, what falls and what follows. I need to explain something about that first night, because the events that came after it only make sense if you understand what I learned in those hours. Her name was Vithara. I got that early, in the first quiet period after I'd gotten her settled in my shelter, propped against the back wall with a thermal blanket around her, and my lantern set to a low warm frequency, because the blue-white of my usual setting seemed to cause her discomfort, not pain, just something like the equivalent of a headache. Her full name was longer and had elements my implant rendered phonetically as something like clicking consonants, but she told me to use Vithara and I did. She was Ivhari. That's the species name, and the moment she said it, my implant kicked into a category of its database that I hadn't accessed in a while. Sapient species, diplomatically significant galactic compact member states, high status. The Ivhari were not a common sight in the border territories. They were, as far as my out-of-date knowledge went, a founding species of the original compact, one of the first 3 civilizations to establish the framework that the current political structure had grown from. Old money, you could say, if you were translating galactic politics into human economic terms. Old power, respected, protected. In theory. She told me what had happened in fragments, pausing often when the pain flared, letting my implant struggle through the translation gaps. I asked questions when I needed to and stayed quiet when I didn't. I've found with people who have been through something that the worst thing you can do is rush them or pepper them with questions that aren't necessary right then. Let them tell it the way it needs to come out. She was traveling. That was the baseline. She'd been in transit through the Iron 5 border corridor as part of a diplomatic circuit. The Ivhari maintained a system of what she called, in my implant's rendering, witness travelers, individuals from significant families who moved through the compact's less monitored territories to observe, document, and report back to the Ivhari Homeworld Council. Not spies exactly, more like auditors, living inspections. The compact officially knew this system existed and officially tolerated it because the Ivhari were a founding species, and you don't tell a founding species they can't do a thing that's been in their cultural practice for 800 years. Unofficially, not everyone in the compact loved the system, particularly not the military administrative factions that had been expanding their operational footprint into the border worlds over the last decade. Particularly, not the commanders and officers who were running certain operations in border territories that would not benefit from careful Ivhari observation and documentation. Vithara had been observing one such operation. She didn't give me specifics that first night, and I didn't push. What she gave me was the shape of it. She had documentation. Her family's witness travelers used a method of biological data storage, essentially encoding information into a crystalline structure that grew within the body, in a gland behind the ear, that was essentially undetectable with standard scanning technology. She'd seen things in Iron 5 Administrative District. She'd recorded them, and someone had found out. Which someone? I asked. She told me the name. My implant translated it with what I can only describe as a tone of difficulty, like the word itself was heavier than surrounding words. Commander Havorath Drell, Compact Military Command, Border Territory Administration Division. I knew the name in the way you know names of powerful, distant things, abstractly from second-hand information, the way you know about weather systems on planets you've never visited. Drell had been in the border territories for 3 years. He had a reputation for getting results, which in border world administration meant a reputation for not getting in the way of profitable operations, with too many questions about legality. He'd had Vithara taken, 4 of his soldiers, in a vehicle marked with civilian freight insignia, which was already illegal. That marking was protected under the Compact's shipping accords, had intercepted her transit shuttle, and brought her to a point on the Verath Canyon rim above a section where the canyon was roughly 900 meters deep. And they'd thrown her off. They didn't execute you, I said. Not a question, just I was processing it. They threw you. Canyon executions don't leave evidence the way a weapon's discharge does. And the fall survival rate from this canyon. 0, she said. My implant was getting more comfortable with her speech patterns. The translation was cleaner now. No one survives the fall. The thermal columns in the middle section, they calculated that I would be broken apart in them before I reached the bottom. The impact on the cliff face was, she paused, a breath, assumed certain. But you had that bioluminescence going when you fell. That sound, was that? A distress emission, she said. Involuntary. When an Ivhari experiences extreme danger the body emits. I couldn't stop it. And what actually stopped you from hitting the wall? She looked at her hands for a moment. The light pattern in her skin was calmer now than when she'd first landed, slower, more regular, the blues deeper and less agitated. The thermal columns, she said. They pushed me. The distress emission, it creates a resonance with certain air pressure systems. I think I am not certain that the resonance in the thermal columns altered my trajectory. Enough, but not enough. I would still have impacted. Except for the human who was waiting at the bottom, I said. She looked at me with those shifting eyes for a long moment. Yes, she said very quietly, except for that. I sat with that for a second. The silence in the canyon at night was a particular kind of silence, not empty but textured. The river, the occasional settling sound of rock, wind somewhere far above. This documentation you have, I said, what happens if it gets out? Another long pause. She was deciding, I understood, how much to tell a human stranger at the bottom of a canyon. I didn't blame her for the hesitation. I would have done the same. Drell's operation has been routing resources from border-world settlements, she said, finally. Not contraband shipping, not the things that compact enforcement occasionally investigates and occasionally ignores. He has been redirecting resources from the settlement fund allocations, credits and material that are designated for the Iron 5 civilian population under the Expansion Compact's provision protocols. He has been taking them, systematically, for 3 years. What I documented is the mechanism, the accounts, the names of the officers who participate. That's massive, I said. The Ivhari Witness Council will take it to the Compact Oversight Chamber, she said. If it reaches them, Drell knows this. That is why she stopped. I watched her compose herself. It was a visible effort. That is why he disposed of me. He's going to send someone down to verify, I said. When the patrol shift changes, when someone asks where the witness traveler went, when Drell realizes the body isn't visible from above, he's going to send someone down to confirm. Yes, she said. How long do we have? He'll want to know quickly, she said. He'll want confirmation before the transit log discrepancy is noticed. A patrol cycle is, she did something with her fingers, calculating in whatever system she used. 12 hours, possibly 10. I looked at the shelter walls, looked at my tools, looked at the door of the shelter opening onto the dark canyon beyond, where the river murmured and the shadows of mining equipment stood silent. Okay, I said. Okay, she repeated, with a tone that was somewhere between questioning and disbelieving. I need to think, I said, and you need to sleep if you can. The pain will be worse if you don't rest. I'll keep watch. She looked at me with an expression I was getting better at reading, that particular Ivhari expression that seemed to sit between assessment and vulnerability. Why are you doing this? She said. I thought about it. The honest answer had a few layers and most of them weren't particularly heroic. I was already a fugitive. Helping a diplomatic witness against a corrupt compact officer was the kind of action that would either get me pardoned or get me killed, and those were the same odds I was already playing. Plus, I'd already saved her once, which created a kind of investment. You catch someone falling out of a canyon, you've put something in. But under all that, the simpler truth, someone had thrown her off a cliff. Someone with power and soldiers and official vehicles had taken a young woman, and she was young. I was increasingly certain of that, and thrown her into a canyon to die because she'd seen things she wasn't supposed to see. And that made me angry in a way that was clean and uncomplicated, and that I didn't need to analyze too much. "You fell," I said. "I was there, that's all." She accepted that with a small nod. Then she closed her eyes, and I went to the shelter entrance to watch the canyon below. Part 3. What lives at the bottom? By the 4th hour, Kessa knew. Kessa's shelter was about 60 meters down the canyon wall from mine, and Kessa had been at the bottom of Verath for longer than anyone except Reth, and had developed, over that time, a sense for disturbance in the canyon that bordered on mystical. She came picking her way along the cliff-face path an hour before the moons were at zenith, three-fingered hands feeling along the rock, her blue-gray Vrethian body compact and careful in the darkness. She crouched at the entrance of my shelter, looked inside at the sleeping Ivhari, looked at me and said, in the flat, practical galactic standard she always used, "That's an Ivhari." "Yes," I said. "She fell. Someone threw her." A pause. Kessa's species registered emotion primarily in the color changes of their scalp markings, and right now hers had gone to a deep amber that meant, in my experience of Kessa, that she was doing serious calculation. Compact soldiers. A commander named Drell. Kessa was quiet for a full 30 seconds. Then Havoreth Drell. "You know him." "He shut down the Vrethian monitoring station at Iron 5 Northern Pass 14 months ago," she said. "The station was documenting animal population shifts. He said it was an unauthorized installation. He filed the removal order through 3 separate legal channels simultaneously, so that by the time the Vrethian Science Collective even knew the order existed, the station was already physically gone." She looked at her hands. "I think the station was documenting something else, incidentally. I think the animal population monitoring was real but secondary. I think the primary purpose was observing freight movement through the northern pass." "How do you know this?" "Because the Vrethian who ran the station sent a message before they went silent," she said. "It was fragmented, but the word they used in the old academic register, not the trade language, translates to something like witness." She looked at me steadily. "I came here to study canyon ecology, Marcus. Partly. That is true. But partly I came here because the bottom of Verath Canyon is the one point on Iron 5 where sensor sweeps are blind and freight tracking loses coverage." She paused. "I've been watching too." I stared at her. "What have you been watching?" I asked. "The same thing she has," Kessa said, with a small nod toward the shelter. "I just lack the documentation capacity of an Ivhari witness. I have observations, she has recordings." She let that sit. "Together, that is rather more robust." Inside the shelter, I heard the quality of breathing change. Not waking up, but hearing. I thought Vethara had been listening for at least the last few minutes. "There are more of you," came her voice from inside, quiet, precise. "Others who have been observing." Kessa looked at me. I shrugged. She looked back at the shelter entrance and said, "To the room. At the bottom of Verath Canyon, there are approximately 40 individuals who, for various reasons, exist outside the compact's administrative visibility. Of those 40, perhaps 12 have been here long enough to have noticed patterns in what moves through Iron 5 freight corridors and doesn't show up in shipping manifests." A pause. "Reth has been here for 11 years. He has a paper record that he keeps in a waterproof case under a rock near the river. He doesn't trust digital storage. He writes everything down." The silence from inside the shelter was long and weighted. 11 years, said Vethara. 11 years, Kessa confirmed. Vethara came to the shelter entrance. She moved carefully. She was hurt, her left arm in the field dressing, her body still recovering from what a fall from 900 meters almost does to you, even when a human with thermal blankets partially breaks it. She stood in the entrance with the thermal blanket around her shoulders, and she looked at Kessa for a long time with those shifting blue-green eyes. I need to reach my witness counsel, she said. Is there communication infrastructure at the canyon bottom? Nothing official, I said. There is the old mining communication relay, Kessa said. The Torvath Consortium installed a deep canyon signal relay for their operations. When they abandoned the site, they left it. It hasn't been used in decades. The power cell is almost certainly dead. She paused. Marcus could look at it. They both looked at me. I could look at it, I agreed. Part 4, the relay. The Torvath mining relay was housed in a sealed metal cabinet about the size of a large wardrobe, set into the canyon wall on the south side near the base of one of the old boring rigs. I'd seen it hundreds of times. I'd never opened it, because what would have been the point? I had no need for a deep canyon communication relay that hadn't functioned in 60 years. Now I pried the access panel off with a long tool and shone my lantern inside. Paul showed up while I was in the first stages of assessment. Former compact medic, lean, dark-skinned, with the kind of face that had clearly processed a lot of experience and had settled into a permanent state of watchful neutrality. He stood about 3 meters back and watched me work for a moment, then looked at Vethara, who was sitting on a crate nearby because standing was still uncomfortable, and then back at me. "Ivhari," he said. "Yes," I said, not looking up from the relay interior. "Fell. Throne. Drell's people." I stopped and looked at him. "You know about Drell?" "I was at Iron 5 North Garrison for 2 years, Paul said, "before I left." He said it in the tone that meant, and I'm not going to explain why I left. Drell arrived 14 months into my posting. I was transferred out 6 months later, officially for reassignment. Actually because I'd made an official medical complaint about the treatment of civilian detainees. The weight of the night kept accumulating. "What happened to your complaint?" I asked. "Filed," he said, "processed, closed, insufficient supporting evidence." He said this with the zero inflection of someone who has fully processed a particular species of institutional betrayal. Then, "What's wrong with the relay?" "Power cell's dead," I said. "The rest of the system looks functional, surprisingly. These old Torvath installations were overbuilt, but without power it's a metal box." "What power source does it need?" I pulled up the unit specifications from a scratched plate on the interior wall and read them off. Paul listened, then turned and walked away without a word. I watched him go. "He'll find something," Kessa said, from where she was standing against the rock wall, arms folded. "Or he won't," I said. "He'll find something," she said. The confidence of someone who'd had 4 years to take the measure of her fellow canyon residents. Paul came back in 40 minutes with a salvaged power core from one of the mining cranes. He'd modified the output coupling with 2 pieces of metal that he'd bent using a rock and a crate edge. It was brutal engineering and it was absolutely functional. We got the relay online. The signal that came out of it wasn't strong. It wasn't going to punch through to galactic communications infrastructure. But the Deep Canyon relay had been designed to connect to a surface repeater station that the mining consortium had installed on the plateau above the canyon rim. And that station, Reth told us, because Reth had arrived by the time we had power going, drawn by the sound of the relay's startup cycle, which apparently he recognized from when the mining operations had been briefly active during his 2nd year at the canyon bottom. That station was still there, still operational. Because no one had bothered to decommission it, and these old heavy industrial era station units ran on geothermal tap and would run essentially until the planet stopped having a warm core. We had a signal path. Vethara sat down in front of the relay. I gave her the best interface I could build from what I had. It was rough, translation between Ivhari communication protocols, and the old Torvath mining relay format was not seamless, and she began to transmit. It took 2 hours. She was methodical and patient, and she didn't rush even when I told her, at the 90-minute mark, that patrol cycles suggested Drell's people might be mobilizing to send someone down. She looked up at me with a calm that I found genuinely startling given everything that had happened to her in the last 8 hours and said, "If I transmit incomplete or rushed data and something is corrupted, this was all for nothing. I'll take the time I need." I didn't argue. While she transmitted, Reth came and sat next to me on a piece of old mining machinery. Reth was the oldest person I'd ever seen up close. I say person generically because I was never entirely certain of his species, and in 4 months I'd felt too awkward to ask directly. He was humanoid, definitely. Very small, very old, very weathered. He carried a waterproof case at all times. He put the case on his knee. "You want to know what's in it," he said. This was, by count, the 5th or 6th sentence I'd ever heard Reth speak in 4 months. "You've been keeping records for 11 years, I said. "Paper records," he said, patting the case. 11 years of freight observation, movement patterns, weight discrepancy analyses, timing irregularities. I cross-referenced with published settlement fund allocation schedules when I could get them, old issues mostly, pre-drell but useful for establishing baseline. He opened the case. Inside was a compressed stack of handwritten sheets, dense with notation, organized by date. Even in the low lantern light I could see the meticulous consistency of the record-keeping. "I've been here because I knew that eventually someone would need this," he said. "You've been waiting," I said. "I've been preparing," he said. "There's a difference." He looked at Vithara at the relay console. "Her people's documentation will carry more weight than mine, but mine provides 11 years of context. The pattern is the proof. You can falsify a single event. You cannot falsify 11 years of movement data that matches the falsified records exactly." I looked at him. He looked at me. In his eyes was the very particular expression of someone who has been patient for a very long time and is now, finally, at the moment they've been patient for. "We'll need to get it transmitted too," I said. "I know," he said. "I've been digitizing sections on a pocket unit for the past year just in case of a moment like this." He paused. "I didn't expect it to be a human who triggered the moment." "Does that bother you?" He considered the question seriously. "No," he said. "Humans tend to be at the bottom of things, metaphorically and apparently literally. The smallest hint of something that might have been a smile. I find it appropriate." Part 5 Descent. They came down 5 hours after Vithara transmitted. Not from the rim, not a direct descent. That would have taken too long and was too visible. They came in through the canyon's eastern approach, which was a long, winding, ground-level path that the canyon geology had left passable, used historically by the mining consortium for ground vehicle access. I didn't know they were coming that way until Kessa's early warning system triggered. She'd built something more sophisticated than mine, using the canyon's natural acoustic properties to detect ground vehicle movement at about 2 kilometers. She came to me running. Kessa didn't run. Seeing Kessa run was enough information on its own. "Ground vehicles," she said. "Eastern approach. 4, I think, moving without lights." 4 vehicles without lights meant military. Compact soldiers doing a civilian search don't bother with light discipline. Light discipline is for people who expect to encounter opposition. I looked at what we had. The canyon floor, 40 people, most of them asleep, the mining equipment, the river, the relay which had finished transmitting and was now just a metal box again. Kessa, Paul, Reth, and an Ivhari diplomatic witness who could barely walk without pain. My pulse carbine. "How far out?" I said. 2 kilometers, maybe slightly more, Kessa said. "Ground vehicles are slow on the approach path. The surface is rough. 20 minutes, maybe 25. "Wake everyone up," I said. "To do what?" Kessa said. "To get them into position," I said, and I explained fast what I had in mind. The thing about the Torvath mining equipment, is that it was built for an industrial operation that involved moving very large quantities of very dense material in a space with difficult access. The equipment was massive, heavy, and at some key points, still functional. The power systems on the vehicles were dead, but the mechanical components, the structural components, the things that were metal and cable and counterweight, were old and overbuilt, and they'd survived 60 years at the canyon bottom because they didn't need power to exist. A crane arm, for instance, doesn't need power to be in the way. A series of ore collection bins, each weighing roughly 3 tons, positioned in a line across the only navigable vehicle approach route, doesn't need power to be an obstacle. And the mining site had been built with something called a blast warning system, a series of acoustic amplifiers set into the canyon walls that had been used to warn workers of controlled detonations during excavation. They were designed to make a lot of noise, very loud, directed, across a wide area. They ran on the same geothermal tap that ran the surface repeater station. I am not a military person. I want to be clear about that. I'm a mechanic. I fix things. But I've spent 4 months at the bottom of a canyon learning every piece of equipment here, and I've spent my whole life working with machines, and machines are machines regardless of what they were built for. The principles transfer. I had 20 minutes. We used all of them. Paul was the one who thought of the cable system. The mining operation had used a system of horizontal guide cables stretched between the canyon walls at various heights to move loaded ore hoppers from the dig sites to the processing area. The cables were still in place, but the hoppers were stationary, loaded with the last ore material the crews had collected before the accident shut the operation down. Roughly 40 tons of ore, distributed across 6 hoppers, hanging on cables stretched across the eastern approach of the canyon. Paul walked the cable system in the dark with a tension wrench and loosened the hopper locks. When a vehicle came under those cables, the hoppers could be released manually from the cliff face control stations. 40 tons of ore would not fall straight down. The cables would control the drop, but they would create a very sudden and very total blockade across the approach route. We weren't trying to fight compact soldiers. We weren't stupid. We were trying to buy time. The transmission was complete. The Ivhari Witness Council had an emergency acknowledgement protocol, and Kessa told us, because Kessa knew things, that the nearest Ivhari diplomatic vessel that would have received the transmission was stationed at the Iron 5 transit hub, which was approximately 90 minutes away at military cruise speed. We needed 90 minutes. Reth positioned himself near the blast warning controls. He said he knew how to operate them because he'd studied the mining operations historical documentation, which I absolutely believed. Kessa took the eastern cliff face path that gave access to the hopper release controls. Paul took the western face as a medical post, which was where Vethara also was. I'd moved her there, higher up, out of the vehicle approach path. I was at the canyon floor. I want to be honest about how that felt. I had my pulse carbine. I was one person. The vehicles coming down the eastern approach were military, which meant the soldiers inside them had weapons that made mine look like a child's toy. Military-grade shielding, military-grade communications, military-grade training. I was a freight mechanic from Earth who'd been hiding in a canyon for 4 months. But here is the thing about the canyon floor. Here is what I'd learned in 4 months that those soldiers didn't know, couldn't know, because they'd never been here and they were moving in the dark without lights. Verath Canyon's floor was not a flat, navigable space. The river had carved it, and the mining operation had worked it, and 60 years of settlement had shifted it further. And what looked from above like a flat, dark surface was actually a complex topography of channels, depressions, rock formations, and equipment footprints that were navigable on foot if you knew them, and were essentially impassable for vehicles if you didn't. I let the vehicles come. The first one hit a natural rock channel, a depression in the canyon floor about 1.5 meters deep that ran perpendicular to the approach direction, at about 15 kilometers per hour. The impact wasn't catastrophic. The vehicle lurched, high-sided, and stopped. Military vehicles are robust. But the lurch triggered the driver's instinct to stop and assess, which meant the whole column stopped. In that moment of stillness, RETH triggered the blast warning system. I have thought about this moment many times since. The sound that came out of those canyon wall amplifiers, designed to carry detonation warnings across a working industrial site in one of the most acoustically complex environments on Iron 5, was not a weapon. It was a warning signal, but at full power in the enclosed space of the canyon, with the walls focusing and reflecting the sound, it was an overwhelming physical experience. Every person at the canyon bottom, including me, and I knew it was coming, felt it in their chest, their teeth, their bones. For 3 full seconds, the sound was the only thing in the universe. The soldiers in those vehicles had not known it was coming. Kessa released the hoppers. 40 tons of ore across 6 channels, dropping 2 meters onto the canyon floor via controlled cable release, created a line of obstacles across the eastern approach that no vehicle was getting through. No one was hurt. Kessa had timed the release for the moment the column was stopped, not moving, but the approach was closed. I stood at the canyon floor and looked at the stopped vehicles, and I said, into the silence after the sound, "This is a private settlement operating under humanitarian shelter provisions of the Expansion Compact, Article 19. You are in violation of those provisions. State your authorization or withdraw." I had no idea if Article 19 actually said that. I'd read it once, years ago, in a contractor's compliance document. But it sounded specific and legitimate, and in my experience, specific and legitimate sounds can buy time. There was a long silence from the vehicles. Then a voice, amplified, cold, used to being obeyed. "This is Compact Military Command under authority of Commander Havorath Drell. You are harboring a fugitive from Compact Justice. Release the fugitive or this installation will be cleared by force." I thought, by force. He's saying by force because he has the authorization to do it if he needs to, but he hasn't done it yet. He's still talking. Talking buys time. "This installation contains 41 civilians," I said, "including members of at least 3 Compact member species. Military action resulting in civilian casualties would require a full oversight report under Compact military conduct provisions. Are you prepared to file that report?" Another silence, longer. "Who are you?" the voice said, and the coldness had a new quality in it, something almost like confusion. "Marcus Dalen Reese," I said. "Human, Iron 5 resident, independent contractor." I paused. "Also the person who was at the bottom of this canyon when the Ivhari diplomatic witness you threw off the rim transmitted a complete record of your operation to the Ivhari Witness Council, including 11 years of corroborating observation data and first-hand testimony from a former Compact medical officer regarding the treatment of civilian detainees." I paused again, for effect. "The transmission completed approximately 45 minutes ago." The silence this time was very different. It had a texture. The texture of someone calculating fast what damage has been done and what options remain. "You have no idea what you've done," the voice said. "I have some idea," I said. "I've had about 4 hours to think about it." Part 6, 90 minutes. They didn't fire. I want to be clear about that because I think people assume, when they hear the story, that there was a firefight, that I had some kind of confrontation that was about weapons and military skill. There wasn't. I'm a mechanic. If those soldiers had decided to advance on foot through the canyon floor in the dark, I would have been in serious trouble and the outcome would have been different. But they didn't. And the reason they didn't, I've thought about this a great deal, is that Drell's operation depended entirely on it being invisible, on there being no record. The moment Vethara's transmission went out, the calculation changed. If they fired on a civilian settlement containing members of multiple compact member species, that was documented. That happened. That was a second enormous problem layered on top of the first enormous problem, and bureaucratic and military self-interest is, in my experience, a powerful moderating force. The instinct to not make the situation worse, to wait, to assess, to see what happens next, is strong in people whose careers depend on not generating official incidents. We still need it to survive the 90 minutes. The way we survived the 90 minutes was not heroic. It was boring. It was talking. I walked back toward the vehicles, not close, not within range of anything easy, and I kept talking. I talked to the soldier who was communicating. Never Drell directly. Drell wasn't in the canyon. I was sure of that. Drell was at his command post being told things were not going according to plan. I talked about the settlement provisions. I talked about the 41 residents. I talked, at considerable length and with a level of detail I absolutely made up on the spot, about the specific legal processes involved in compact military action against Ivhari diplomatic witnesses. I cited provisions that didn't exist and article numbers that I invented. I sounded absolutely certain the entire time. Meanwhile, up on the western cliff face, Paul was keeping Vethara stable, and the canyon's other residents were doing what people who have been invisible long enough do when they finally decide to be visible. They were documenting. Personal recording devices, handwritten notes, anything they had. 41 witnesses, creating a contemporaneous record. 73 minutes after the vehicle stopped, the sky above the canyon rim changed. I saw it from the floor. A new light, very white, very clean, that wasn't the moon's or the stars. And then sound. The distinctive deep frequency of military-grade thruster arrays. The kind that the Ivhari used on their diplomatic vessels, which were not large but were extraordinarily well-armed and which were, by every compact treaty provision, untouchable. The Ivhari diplomatic vessel came over the rim and descended into the canyon. It was sleek and dark, and covered with the shifting light patterns that I now recognized as bioluminescent design elements. Ivhari aesthetics running through their technology the same way they ran through their biology. It was maybe 30 meters long, and it fit in the canyon with careful geometry, and it landed in the flat gravel area. The same flat gravel area where Vethara had almost landed 8 hours ago. The hatch opened. Ivhari diplomatic personnel, armed, moving with the particular efficiency of people who'd been briefed in transit and knew exactly where they were going. And behind them, slower, still wrapped in the thermal blanket, came Vethara. She'd made her way down from the western cliff face when the vessel appeared, moving carefully, arm bandaged, bioluminescence at a steady and calm slow pulse. She walked across the canyon floor and she stopped near me, and we stood together and watched the diplomatic personnel move toward the stopped military vehicles. The conversation between the Ivhari diplomatic team and Drell's soldiers was not long. I couldn't hear most of it, but I could see the physical posture of the soldiers, and I knew what that posture meant. They were done. They were standing the way people stand when the game is fully over and they know it. "It's finished," I said to Vethara quietly. The transmission went to the compact oversight chamber simultaneously with the witness council, she said. Drell's command codes were frozen 4 minutes after the signal arrived. He's under compact detention order. His officers are under suspension. She paused. The 11 years of supplementary documentation will take longer to process, but it will be processed. The witness council does not let things like this resolve incompletely. I looked at the vessel, at the diplomatic personnel doing their work, at the stopped military vehicles on the far side of the Ore-Hopper blockade, at Kessa on the cliff face, still at the Hopper controls, watching everything with those amber-marked eyes, at Reth, sitting near the blast warning controls, his waterproof case on his knee, waiting calmly for whatever came next. "What happens to everyone here?" I said. "The 41 residents, Most of us have legal complications. The Ivhari Witness Council, Vethara said carefully, has considerable influence with the Compact Oversight Chamber, particularly when the legal complications were generated by the same operation that has just been exposed. She looked at me directly. I cannot promise outcomes, but I can tell you that the council is aware of what everyone here did tonight, and the council does not forget debts. I thought about that. It was a human concept, debts. Or maybe it wasn't, maybe it was universal. Maybe every species that had ever built something complex enough to be called a civilization had built the concept of debt into it, because civilization runs on the recognition that sometimes someone does something for you that you can't immediately repay. I didn't do it for a debt, I said. I know, she said. That makes it more meaningful, not less. The lanterns of the canyon settlement were coming on, one by one, as people woke up fully and emerged from their shelters to see what was happening. The canyon floor was filling with a low, warm light that made the old mining equipment look less like ruin and more like architecture. The river caught the light and broke it and spread it. In the sky above, between the canyon walls, the stars were getting sharper as the night deepened. When they fell me off the rim, Vethara said, after a long quiet, they believed no one would be below. They believed the bottom was empty. That was the entire logic of the method. She paused. They did not account for the possibility that someone had chosen to be there. Most people don't account for the possibility that someone is at the bottom, I said. Is that a human observation? It's a personal one, I said. She made a sound that my implant rendered as a complex emotional compound, something between rueful acknowledgement and the specific warmth of a bond forming unexpectedly. I will tell the Witness Council, she said, that the bottom of Verath Canyon is occupied. I will recommend it be noted in the formal record. I'd appreciate that, I said.